Our next issue on the agenda is we're going to be talking about emergency services, and that's been briefly touched on today too, as the mayor from Dickinson said, staffing. We run into it in Williston as well. One of the biggest pressures we have is these cities where we're kind of between volunteers and full-time fire departments is how do you staff? These guys go out on their oil field jobs, and as Dennis said, they may be 2 hours away from home when the call comes out. They're not going to get here. And then what do you do to replace them? Tioga, for example, Ray Tioga up in my area, an EMS call. They've got a great group of volunteers running their system up there. They're burned out. Watford City, you've seen the news on that. What did those people do? You know, those of us that have served in the military and seen some of the horrific things you see in those areas, that's what these people have to deal with almost every day. Important quality of life issue. So with that, we're going to be talking about a study that's recently been completed by Alteg Engineering. We have two speakers with us today, Mike Schnetzer from Alteg, who has 15 years of experience in GIS technology, and Joel Quanbeck, who has 25 years of experience in planning. Joel's also been involved with our Vision West North Dakota process. They'll explain how the study was developed and the results that show the worst of the worst in terms of EMS service and how we can maybe go on from here to make things better. Please welcome Mike and Joel.
Thank you, Brad. In the middle of our presentation, we're going to do a little switcheroo here so that I can let Mike show you some fancy GIS footwork. But my name is Joel Quanbeck, and we had the opportunity to work with your group to think about one of those quality of life areas that maybe didn't get as much publicity as it should, and that's emergency services. My introduction to the issue of emergency services was really working in Dunn County and watching county employees all of a sudden get calls that put them out on runs that may have left them out of their office for a half a day. And that was a standard operating procedure. And the more I thought about that, and I recognized how this part of the impacts of the oil boom really affect your daily life, I could see why there's burnout that I was hearing about happening. So what we're going to do to start is just give you a very brief overview of the first phase of the project, what we originally intended to do, and then Mike is going to share with you some of the results of the more detailed work we went after. So in the beginning, we intended to assess the gaps in emergency services, especially in ambulance and in fire department services. Both of those are basically volunteer services across western North Dakota. And then these other two phases came about as we got into the findings of the first level. So assessing gaps in coverage was dealing with primarily the geography. Exactly how far out can we reasonably expect that our services can provide a reasonable level of service? And then we were also asked to help identify some possible ways to help fill the gaps. So here's the study area. These are the counties that we looked at, and we looked at every ambulance and every fire service in those counties. The basic process we use is a GIS-driven calculation process. And Mike could give you lots of details about that, but then you'd have to spend another half a day here. So what we're really going to do is just say that what this map shows you is the road network that was out there. And realistically, driving on certain roads, you know you have to go slower than on other roads. And so the different colors that are represented here represent anticipated speeds that you would be able to travel if the road wasn't under construction, if you were an ambulance and fire service. And the basic system that we used was to identify where the fire and ambulance services were located and then figure out how far they could go in a given amount of time based on the speeds that you'd expect to travel on those roads. There is a sort of standard of care, if you might think about it that way, for ambulance services in different settings. In the urban setting, the target is to do that within 7 minutes, to get to the site of the 911 need in 7 minutes. In rural area, they've set that standard at 20 minutes, and in frontier areas where there's very little population, at 30 minutes. The first blush of that analysis for the ambulance services left us with a map that looked like this. The blue color represents the 20-minute time frame for how far they could get from ambulance services, and the stars, or those blue asterisks, represent the locations for the ambulance services. And then the teal area, or the teal color, represents how far they'd get in the 30 minutes. And here's what it looks like for the fire. Again, the fire trucks represent locations for each of the fire stations, and then the orange color represents 20 minutes and the yellow color represents 30 minutes. So after that initial analysis, we recognized it was pretty important for us not to assume that we understood everything now. So we spent some time talking to emergency service providers and emergency service managers, or the emergency service, I'm not even thinking of the right term, but every county has an emergency service leader, and talking with those people to try and make sure that we understood the way things really work. Some of the things we learned about are, first of all, really almost all of these services are being run almost 100% by volunteers. And there are a certain set of impacts because of that. Second of all, road conditions really are horrendous a lot of times, and it's not necessarily just because they're under construction. It might be because, look, we're dealing with a snowstorm where we haven't cleared the roads out, or we just got 2 inches of rain, or on and on. You know the story, you live here. Dispatching choices also makes a difference, and we won't spend time on that. We also learned about substations and how the way the ambulance services in particular are set up might change based on substations. And then sometimes there's a cooperation level needed where you don't just need an ambulance there, you need the fire department there too, just to get to the jaws of life. So we ended up with a refined level of coverage based on revised calculations, where we took a year of data from ambulance and fire services and said, well, how far do people get from, or how far can they get from where the station is if you account for one critical factor, and that was the fact that because they're volunteers, they actually have to get to the station before they can head out. So if I have 20 minutes and it takes my volunteer 5 minutes to get to the station before he can get in the ambulance and take off, I'm really only dealing with 15 minutes of drive time to meet the 20-minute response time criteria we're looking at. So that's what the refined coverage areas look like. Now we're just showing you the 20-minute time, but it's really a 14.7-minute time. And then this is what it looks like for fire departments. Pretty different look to the picture, isn't it? So I'm not going to spend much time more here before I get Mike up here to talk about the details of where this study went. But when we were thinking about, well, how do we deal with the gaps? There were some things that became evident from talking to providers and also to the North Dakota Department of Health. First of all, keep in mind that there isn't a mandate for EMS services in North Dakota. It's all volunteer, grassroots driven. A community decided we need ambulance services, and they put together their system. There have been a number of other studies done that covered areas that we didn't think about or work on at all, and they have important things to say. The Department of Health has done some thinking about what reasonable levels of EMS service are in North Dakota. They have something important to say. And they also put together some estimates for what it would take to actually provide emergency services for ambulance across the state of North Dakota if you had full-time staff operating instead of the volunteer staff that they have. And the numbers that you get are tens of millions of dollars instead of a fraction of that amount. So in summary, we had a very limited time to do this because we're aiming at getting some information in time for the legislature to be done. There are significant gaps in coverage. There's both a need for short-term and long-term solutions, and we'd be happy to talk with you more about that. But whatever we do, because of the fact it's volunteers that are running this, and there's a lot of community pride and community-driven influence, community leadership, whatever we do has to have a grassroots interim or focus. Mike?
Thank you, Joel, and good morning, everybody. Phase 2 and 3 is what I'm going to talk about, and basically the objective is to narrow the focus. So Joel talked about, okay, here's the areas where there's existing coverage, the 14.7 minute drive time for the ambulance facilities. And we have this huge gap. And so let's narrow the focus so that the association, Vicki and Brady, can dial in a little bit further and focus their efforts on the greatest need. So that's what the analysis was centered around. So here's, Joel, if you want to go ahead and activate the interactive map there. Joel's going to zoom in a little bit and just give you a little bit better idea on the on the data that we mapped. And you'll see the 14.7 minute drive time is using the street network, and you can see it's you can see there's a lot of gaps. Maybe zoom out a little bit, Joel. And so where do you start? It's very difficult to do that. How do you do this with identifying where the greatest need is? So what we implemented was using data and facts to do this. And so the factors of influence that you see there on the left are the 4 primary factors of influence that we modeled. That was decided a combination of available data and what made sense, using common sense. So I'm going to step through on how we actually did that. What we did is use a process called suitability analysis, and it's using cell-based modeling. And this is a common technique for assisting in locating of something. It could be maybe a substation. It could be future land use, which this is kind of depicting here as a sample. And so we use this methodology, and how it works is you have GIS data that you start with, and so this little example at the bottom there is stepping through this suitability analysis for a future commercial ideal locations for commercial property. And this is just to kind of set the stage for the methodology that we used, and then I'll get into the actual ambulance study. So you have area of pasture, you have area of wetland. For commercial property, what we did was all of this information is converted to cells, cell-based modeling. So the entire coverage area, think of as a grid. And we used 1,000-foot grid sizes. Every grid had a value. And so in this example, areas of pasture would be a lot more suitable for commercial than a wetland. So that gets a high score. So we're assigning a value, a 10. And the wetland is less desirable, and so that gets a low score. And so every cell in this entire coverage area has values assigned to it. And using those factors of influence, they're overlaid to come up with a ranking, high to low, of suitability. So the first factor of influence is using population. And this is using census data, 2012, census block groups. And basically we reclassified the data into 3 categories, high, middle, and lowest. So the higher populations were given a higher weight because it would be likely that there's a greater need for emergency services in those areas. The other factor of influence is proximity to cities, and proximity to cities that don't have existing service. The phase 1, we mapped the existing coverage area. This is taking a look at the cities that don't have any service, or facility, I should say. And we gave emphasis to closer to the city would be a higher score. The idea is there's current infrastructure, and there's maybe a better labor force to pool from, and maybe more desirable to live than a rural location. The third data set we used was DOT crash data. And this was based in 2012 data. And essentially what we did, we had all of the specific locations of accidents and we created hotspots. So areas that had high clusters of accidents were a hotspot. And so the hotspots were given a greater score because there was more likely of greater need for ambulance service. So trying to use some factual data, historical data, to help with the final results. And then finally we used ambulance runs, and this was 2012 based on the various emergency service zones. And again, areas that had high ambulance runs have a greater need for service, and that was is given a high score. So, okay, we're getting back to our analysis. Now we have all this good data. We have all the cells, all the values are there, and we have our 4 layers, and so it's going to, final result is the greatest need, high to low ranking. And so that's what this map here is. And Joel, if you want to activate the map here. So the red is the lowest suitability based on all that data. And as you step through, you can see the color scheme up on the top, from gold to yellow, and green being the greatest need. And the areas in white are not part of the study because that's an area that is served existing by the 14.7 minute drive time. So you can see all of our nice cells there, and a lot of data to absorb. And this is gives the association a narrow focus, because now they can say, okay, hey, let's look at these green areas, because that's the area of greatest need. So go ahead and let's move to the next slide here. So what we did for kind of the final map or the final analysis was we basically just singled out the greatest need clusters. And as this is activating here, you'll see the blue, and that's the existing coverage. And it's important to look at these two together to be able to say, okay, there's about 4 clusters here, I think 4 or 5 clusters of greatest need, and that's in purple. And so you look, for example, around Minot and Williston and even Dickinson a little bit. There are some clusters there, and certainly a need, but it's adjacent to, real close to existing coverage. And what we did here was we didn't rank these clusters. This is equal value, but now it's a narrowed focus for the association to take the next step and say, okay, let's look at these areas. And now we can focus our attention in these purple areas and not in other areas. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't other areas that might be important to talk about, and that could certainly be the case. And what we did here was we took most of the human political environment out of the results here by using science and geography, using facts, using the scoring method, and minimize the human involvement in the results of this. And certainly that could be the case. Maybe there are some things that you can't model that need to be looked at, and that's okay. But this narrows the focus and using facts. So that's basically our the conclusion here. One thing I do want to point out, actually, the URL that you see here, this is available. This is an interactive website. That same data that we went through in the presentation is available for you to look at. You'll have the greatest need locations, and then all of the ranking of the suitability is available for you in there. So I guess at this point, we'll open up for any questions. Vicki and Brady are both here to help with some of the questions if needed.
Mike, I got a question for you. Maybe a detailed question. You said you used DOT crash data to form your layer. I'm just curious, when you used the DOT crash data, did you parse that at all, or did you just use anything that had property damage, or did you get rid of the ones with property damage and just use injury accidents, or how did you manipulate the DOT crash data to facilitate the study?
Joel, you may need to refresh my memory here, but I believe it was just the vehicle-related accidents, not property damage related. I don't know if you recall, Joel. Does that sound right? Okay. Any other questions?
Did you want to explain that you fleshed out the west side of Alexander?
Yeah, you saw early on phase 3. I guess I really didn't talk about that. It's built into here basically. The area west of Alexander, originally we didn't have crash data for that location because it was served Montana facilities, Sydney and Fairview, and so there was a gap in analysis. And Vicki and Brady thought it would be important to try to include that, and so that's what phase 3 was. So we obtained the ambulance run information from those respective facilities in Montana, integrated that back into the model, and it was no significant change. The numbers were, fairly low, I guess.
Can you zoom in on those two of the biggest, greatest need areas and just kind of show the area in more detail?
Sure. Any particular location? Okay.
These show mostly where an ambulance would get to respond to an accident. In most cases, in our little towns, an ambulance volunteer shows up at the house or wherever before the ambulance even gets there. So the volunteer then, I don't know the data, 14.7.
The model is not perfect when you do these kind of models.
When it
Yep.
looks pretty dire, probably someone does show up with first aid at least. That's pretty scary if you lived in that area.
Yep, Joel?
When we talk with the individual county services, one of the things. Excuse me. When we talk with the individual county services or individual ambulance services, we did recognize that issue. But what we had to do is map something that was factual. So you're right. There are frequent occurrences where a first responder may get to the scene before an ambulance does, or for that matter, before a fire truck gets there. So there may be some aid, but if there's a transport, if there's a serious need, that can't happen until the ambulance gets there. So we're at least mapping something consistently.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Joel and Mike, for providing more facts that we need moving forward. This is a big issue. In the military, we deal with something called the golden hour, and we've taken our survival rates for casualties from the 60% in Vietnam that we saw, which were pretty good at that time, up into the 96% level with this golden hour utilization. It's all about getting to the person that's injured within that first hour, not just getting to them, but getting them to a facility for major treatment within that first hour. So EMS is an important issue for us. We appreciate the facts moving forward.